Well, tech stocks following the broader market turnaround this morning. The sector, though, still down more than 5% since last week's Brexit vote. So is this now a tech buying opportunity? Joining us now here at Post 9, Foundation Capital General Partner Paul Holland. Worth noting that Paul was previously vice president with Pure Software, running company operations throughout Europe and the UK. Paul, great to have you with us.
Terrific. Thanks a lot. Nice to see you, John.
So from a tech perspective, and granted, a lot of this Brexit, UK exiting the EU is going to take not only months, but years to play out. But if you are planning your strategy into the future, where to put your workers, where to invest in real estate, where to take out leases, that kind of thing, which is very important for a lot of businesses that are planning international expansion, how has this changed the landscape for you?
I think for companies that are just beginning their efforts to expand to Europe, this is going to be a bit of a shock, just like it was to all of us as we adjusted to the Brexit. As you know, I ran a European operation for a company, Pure Software, when I worked for Reed Hastings prior to his big success at Netflix. And we chose to go to Amsterdam in that case, in part because we wanted to be on the continent. Now I think you're going to see people are going to take a second look at places like Amsterdam, Brussels, Ireland, other places that are still within the EU as they adjust to the news of the UK kind of pulling out of the alliance.
How much do you worry, though, that other countries in the EU ultimately pull out, too? That there's a run for the... I mean, the worst-case scenario is that this is just the first domino.
Right. So I think that, there are many winners and losers in the Brexit, some in the tech sector, some more broadly in the geopolitical sense. And when you start looking at things like what's happening across Europe now, all of the kind of extreme right-wing parties, what George Friedman, the historian, calls the ethno-nationalists, sort of the Trump equivalents in France and Holland and other places, they're the big short-term winners in this. And so they're gathering a lot of attention, getting people to pay attention to the notion of maybe we should pull out too. And my belief is that that's probably not going to happen. I think this is going to be relatively isolated in terms of what's happening in the UK. And I think we're going to begin to see this settle down in the coming weeks as people sort of process this information.
In the medium term, what kinds of companies are going to see the biggest impact from this? Is it the Amazons of the world that are trying to move physical goods throughout Europe and have certain bases of operations? Is it data center players that are trying to put data centers in certain areas where they can serve all of Europe with confidence that they're going to have to abide by the same rules? Is it internet players who are dealing mostly in bits, not atoms?
Right. So I think those are great observations, John, but I would step back a little bit, think about this a little bit more basically. So I ran sales internationally for a couple of companies, and here's how it works. If you've got a lot of exposure to Europe right now, and particularly the UK as a market, your sales reps are coming back and saying, hey, my customers are getting a little nervous. I'm not sure I'm going to get my orders in this quarter. If that starts to roll forward, then you're going to see those companies with the highest exposure to Europe and the UK, the large software companies, the large players in hardware, those are going to be the ones that are going to be the most at risk. I think the broader players, the internet players, the e-commerce players, and so forth, the risk is going to be mitigated for them often because they have a large U.S. presence. If you look at one of our companies, one that we chatted with you about here, we took it public on the NYSE a couple of years ago, Chegg. They're almost entirely focused on the U.S. market in ed tech, very stable space, growing nicely, not a lot of exposure. So we're going to see those companies in the short term kind of look like the winners, and we're going to see some of the companies with the broader exposure. We're going to have to look more closely there and see where the impacts are going to be in this quarter and next quarter.
The big picture, the real dominant U.S. tech companies, do you worry about this kind of political shift toward local, national, retreat from globalism as being something where, the Googles of the world start to seem like somebody else's company?
So that's a terrific observation. So I think I certainly do worry about that notion. If this is the beginning of a retreat of the post-war compact that we've seen, with George Marshall and Konrad Adenauer and people putting together what became the EU, if we're seeing that as a broader retreat, that hurts the Silicon Valley. I think that hurts American business in general. We thrive in sort of a liberal economy around the world, liberal not in the American political sense, but in the real economic sense. And the less liberal we see the economy, the more kind of retrenched and nationalistic we see, the harder it's going to be for companies to sell more easily and to have less friction in the marketplace. If you take it more to the Silicon Valley point right now, as you know, Silicon Valley is all about entries and exits, right? And I'll focus on exits for just a moment. We've gone through a period of the last 9 years of really kind of halcyon days. I mean, just a terrific time. At Foundation, I think we had 10 companies go public in 12 quarters, and we were somewhat typical of the good firms in the Valley. What we'd seen over the last several quarters, as you know, was a pause, right? There was a slowdown in the exit environment, and we were just beginning to see that pick up. You saw Twilio get out, have a really nice exit last week, right in the midst of all the hell that was breaking loose in Europe. So the question mark for us is, what is this going to do to the exit environment, and how does that impact the Silicon Valley? On the entry side, no impact at all. Entrepreneurs are pathologically committed to becoming entrepreneurs, and people show up. You know, we see 3,000 or 4,000 companies a year in terms of what we get exposed to. We tend to fund 10 or 12 of those, and those numbers won't change no matter what's going on with the Brexit.
Are you less likely to back an entrepreneur in London today, perhaps more likely to back one in Barcelona or in Berlin?
I'd say if it's a very specific type of company, that's possible. But if it's a London-based entrepreneur who happens to be named Jeff Bezos or Reed Hastings, then we're going to want to back them no matter what they're doing. So it largely depends.
But there's no sense that we're going to press the pause button just on Europe completely.
No, I wouldn't say we're going to press the pause button. It's too important of a marketplace. It's 340 million consumers. It's the most common market trading partner for most U.S. businesses. So, yeah, yes and no. But again, at the end of the day, Andrew, people are going to want to practice commerce, right? They're going to want to engage in commerce. There will be workarounds. There are going to be things that we can't even anticipate right now. So I think the tendency in the short term is to dig really hard into the negative. I think what you just saw today across Europe and the U.S. markets is people stepping back and going, okay, maybe we overacted a little bit, which is normal human nature.
Is this going to affect tech lobbying domestically, the prospect of instability in Europe, and the idea, as you mentioned, of this nationalism on a level in Europe rising up? Is that going to affect where people like you put your money and the kind of politics that you advocate for?
I think if it continues and it's exacerbated from where it is today, over time, the larger companies are going to have to become stronger and stronger at things like lobbying and how they work with individual governments, whatever might happen to be. In a sort of a supranational world where you have the EU, you have these other bodies that sort of take care of a lot of that for you, it's a little bit easier if you're a large multinational. It just may become more complex for people. Now, I do want to actually touch on something that I don't think I hear a lot of. There is a potential kind of silver lining in this, and I think it's really more focused around the UK market. At the moment, we're very, very focused on all the negatives, the initial drop-off, and so forth. Let's imagine a scenario where the UK actually pioneers a less regulated path, a less sort of obstructionist path toward business. We could see some really interesting things. We could see a bit of a renaissance happening there. If that happens, you're going to see people want to emulate that in other countries and in other marketplaces.
Interesting. Yeah, well, we like silver linings. We like contrarian thinking. Paul Holland from Foundation Capital. Thanks for joining.
Great to see you guys.